didn't think it was an explosion, but the base of the building shook. I felt it shake. I thought, well, that can't be right. It felt like a big weight, a construction weight, falling from a great, great height. People moved out very, very calmly, no screaming or anything like that, but you could see moisture on their eyes and you could hear fear you could hear the fear in their voices. And then when we were outside, the second explosion happened, and there were then a series of explosions. You can see these pictures. The thing that strikes me about these pictures is that some of those emergency vehicles were clearly there when later debris rained on them. So one of the things that happened was basically the structure, the engineering, if you like, of the structure wasn't apparent to the security forces. We are now, 8 hours after that. The operation goes on. We can only wonder at the kind of damage, the kind of human damage which was caused by those explosions, those series of explosions.
How long after the attacks by the planes did the buildings actually collapse? And what happened in that intervening period?
The buildings eventually collapsed, but they collapsed about 2 hours later. There was an explosion when the aircraft hit one of the towers, and then another explosion about, 10 minutes later when a second aircraft hit the second tower. But the building then collapsed about 2 hours later. What we're now getting is this city is now eerie. The avenue behind me in Midtown has been closed off. People are shocked. I know it's a kind of a cliche that people say this about these kind of things, if you can imagine this kind of thing. But people are literally stunned, speechless by this whole thing. People are digesting it. There may well be some kind of appetite for revenge. The television programs are using captions like "America under attack." That word Pearl Harbor keeps cropping up. The president's statement says, "The resolve of our great nation is being tested. Make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test." The mood is, as I say, stunned into silence. There are some angry people about. There was a bit of what we British call the Dunkirk spirit. People literally out in the street calling for the public to give blood. It's a very mixed emotion.
Now, to update you on the whereabouts of President Bush, as you saw, I think, in that report a few minutes ago, he was in Florida when the attacks came. And then he went to an Air Force base in Louisiana, where he made a short statement, and then on to Nebraska. He wasn't going to return directly to Washington during the day. Perhaps there were fears of further attacks on the White House, bearing in mind that the Pentagon had been attacked not far away. But now we hear that President Bush is returning to Washington this evening. This is according to Ari Fleischer, his press spokesman. And he's due to address the nation on television at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. That's in about 2 hours from now. And in other events, American government agencies will be back in business tomorrow in the Washington area. But federal workers will be allowed to take unscheduled leave. Federal agencies in Washington, D.C. Are open for business as usual, said a statement from the agency concerned. And now let's go back to New York and look at some pictures just in showing the Trade Center collapsing. Pictures keep coming in despite it being, almost 10 hours now since the original attack. This is because various footage, many of it from amateurs, is being released to the television stations. And in fact, that is not the World Trade Center. I got some wrong information there. It is the Salomon Brothers building. So that is this evening in New York. It collapsed some 6 hours after the World Trade Center, presumably weakened by the collapse of the World Trade Center just a few blocks away from it. We heard from our correspondent earlier that much of Manhattan is quiet, not many people around. So all being well, the casualty toll in that building should not be very high. But of course there were presumably security and other officials around the building when it did collapse. Worldwide condemnation of the attacks has been swift, and so too have been the denials of guilt. Those responsible would have had money and resources available to only a few terrorist organizations, and the focus of the investigation into America's worst breach of security will inevitably fall on Islamic and extremist groups. As George Ekin reports, It'll be those responsible for previous attacks on the United States interests around the world who'll come under closest scrutiny.
To some, the horror and carnage inflicted on the United States today is a cause of celebration. This was the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, where many showed their approval of a day of unprecedented terror in America's backyard. A claim of responsibility was reported from one Palestinian group, but then swiftly denied. The Palestinian leader condemned the attacks.
We are completely shocked, completely shocked. Unbelievable.
Investigators hunting the organisers will first consider these were airborne suicide missions on a scale not seen since the Second World War.
I think it's almost impossible to believe that a hijacker could convince an American domestic airline pilot to commit suicide by flying into the World Trade Center. I have absolutely no doubt at all they had trained pilots. We know in the past that they've had pilots who have been perfectly capable of flying aircraft, and this can only be the only, I think, answer to this. American pilots would not do this, but Arab fundamentalists may well be prepared to.
And it's this wealthy Arab fundamentalist that American officials are already naming as an immediate suspect, Osama bin Laden. He controls and finances Al-Qaeda, an umbrella network of Islamic militants, and he's vowed to destroy the United States. Bin Laden is accused of masterminding a string of attacks, including the US embassy bombings in East Africa 3 years ago, which killed more than 200 people. In retaliation, the Americans fired cruise missiles at training camps used by bin Laden in Afghanistan. They put a $5 million price on his head and led a worldwide crackdown on Al-Qaeda. Afghanistan's ruling Taliban, which continues to offer bin Laden sanctuary, insists he isn't capable of carrying out attacks like today's. But bin Laden is suspected of involvement in the last attack on the World Trade Center 8 years ago. 6 people died when a bomb exploded in an underground car park. His associate, Ramzi Youssef, was jailed for that and for plotting to blow up a dozen American airliners over the Pacific, a plan which in some respects foreshadowed today's terror. While the possibility isn't being excluded, no one's suggesting that the devastation of such high-profile international targets like the Pentagon and the World Trade Center is domestic terrorism. The sophistication of today's attacks, with highly trained perpetrators and their synchronization to occur within 2 hours, point towards months, if not years, of preparation. Does all this mean, then, that a rogue state might be involved? Some experts are skeptical.
Countries have realized that as governments, their involvement in terrorism has cost them more than it's gained them. And so there are very few countries left who are in the real terrorism business. Obviously, some governments fund groups that may conduct terrorist acts, but that's very different than actually providing government support for it.
State condolences flood in, yet it seems highly unlikely, if not impossible, that the biggest and bloodiest terrorist operation ever could have been planned and prepared without a single government around the world even noticing. George Eakin, BBC News.
Now let's update you on the latest from Afghanistan. We've had reports in the last half hour or so of multiple explosions in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, reports of missiles flying through the air, and denials from the Pentagon. Geeta Gurumurthy is with me. What is the latest word from the Pentagon about these apparent attacks?
That's right. We're hearing from US officials from the Pentagon that this is not a US strike. According to a senior official there, they're saying that an apparent rocket attack is not a method that the United States would use. Of course, they would want to be very clear about who was responsible for events in New York before they did take any kind of action, I think. What they're saying is that this had nothing to do with the US. It might be the work of the Northern Alliance, responding to the attack, if you remember, of an opposition leader, Mr. Massoud, yesterday, who was killed or we're not sure if he was killed or if he was injured, but was certainly attacked in what looked like a suicide attack. And he, of course, was a very prominent figure in the opposition against the Taliban in Afghanistan.
What is the scale of these attacks? Is it clear in Kabul tonight?
It isn't directly clear, but there seem to be reports of explosions in the north of the airport, north of the capital in Kabul, large plumes of smoke reported, and differing reports, but the latest seems to be that no sounds of aeroplanes, no sounds of anti-aircraft fire, which is contrary to what we were hearing just a few minutes ago. So difficult to know how big the scale of these explosions or attacks or whatever they may be, but the Americans very quickly apparently wanting to distance themselves from this.
And some of the firing seemed to be around the airport.
That's right, north of the capital in Kabul. Of course, Osama bin Laden probably wouldn't be in that area anyway, and so it would be interesting to see whether that would be a target.
Thank you. This is BBC World News. Now, our correspondent Mike Wooldridge has been following the day's events, and here's his report.
America's vulnerability to terrorism has never been exposed like this. The second hijacked plane flies into one of the twin towers of the World Trade Center, and a fireball erupts around the 110-story building. The other tower was already ablaze after being hit by another plane only minutes earlier. One plane and one tower might just have been a terrible accident. That possibility was blown apart with the second direct hit. New Yorkers assumed they were reliving the 1993 bombing of this, one of the most famous landmarks of the capitalist world, but this was to be infinitely more audacious. Some of those trapped inside went to desperate lengths in the hope of rescue. The same desperation led others to jump to an inevitable death. There was pandemonium and panic in the streets around the Trade Center as the authorities tried to marshal people away from the area.
What's happening? There's people jumping out of windows. I've seen at least 14 people jumping out of windows. It's horrific. I can't believe this is happening.
We heard a big bang, and then we saw smoke coming out, and everybody started running out, and we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows. Over there, they're jumping out the windows, I guess because they're trying to save themselves. I don't know.
Within the hour, one of the huge towers, constructed to withstand all but the most apocalyptic of events, collapsed.
Thanks very much.
Completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
The attack was too devastating for the second tower as well, and not long after, it too collapsed, filling the streets with yet more debris and dust. Thousands worked in these towers. No one had any idea how many casualties there were, but that they were mounting horrifically was obvious. The mayor of New York predicted that the death toll would be tremendous and ordered the evacuation of South Manhattan. Its streets took on an eerie appearance now as stunned people tried to make their way to safety. But the terrorists, it seems, had other designs. The very heart of the US defense establishment was another of their targets. A third hijacked plane came down in a steep descent over Washington and crashed into the side of the Pentagon, setting off another huge blaze. Apparently, the evacuation of the building had been ordered a few minutes before, but had barely started. A fourth airliner came down in Pennsylvania, some 80 miles from Pittsburgh. This was the scene at the aftermath of that crash. By now, Americans were starting to portray it as the worst attack on their country since Pearl Harbor.
Once again, we see...
That report to go live to Washington, and Donald Rumsfeld, the American Defense Secretary.
Earlier today, and offered his support and was kind enough to come down and has been with us. We've very recently had a discussion with the President of the United States. Chairman Hugh Shelton has just landed from Europe. Secretary of the Army, Tom White, who has a responsibility for incidents like this as executive agent for the Department of Defense, is also joining me. It's an indication that the United States government is functioning in the face of this terrible act against our country. I should add that the briefing here is taking place in the Pentagon. The Pentagon's functioning. It'll be in business tomorrow. I know the interest in casualty figures, and all I can say is